Hi, my name is Kelsey Peltz, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Great Depression versus the Great Recession. My focus question for this project is, how were the causes and effects of the Great Depression and Great Recession similar, and what actions taken by the government, specifically the Federal Reserve, resulted in different outcomes of these economic downfalls? A recession is defined as an economic decline for 6 months or more on a massive scale. A depression is the same as a recession, but instead lasts for years. The Great Recession only lasted for a short 18-month period, while the Great Depression lasted for nearly a decade. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in modern American history, lasting from 1929 to 1939. Tax revenue, profits, prices, and Americans' incomes dropped, resulting in 25% of Americans to become unemployed. The Great Depression had numerous causes, which, when all piled up on each other, led to a colossal economic downfall. The 1920s had a new culture of consumerism. Americans began buying products at accelerating rates, but instead of using cash, they were using credit. Advertisements began to appear everywhere. The economy was thriving, productions were growing, and the stock market had been rising exponentially since 1921. In the 1920s, the Federal Reserve had a deal with the Bank of England to keep interest rates artificially low, making US dollars relatively inexpensive to loan. But in an attempt to limit speculation in securities markets, the Federal Reserve raised the interest rates in 1928, causing the economy to begin to fail. Due to the rise in the economy, companies were producing beyond the limit that can be purchased. Companies decided to cut back on their productions, which led to them having to let go of many of their blue-collar workers, who were the majority of Americans. People began spending less money since they did not have the reassurance of a job to balance their spending on credit. On October 24, 1929, the stock market completely fell, leading to a decline in 33% of the stock market's value, resulting in that day being known as Black Thursday. Many shares were bought with loans, making people obtain massive amounts of debt. The cost of goods and business investments went down, but people had uncertainty about the future, leading them to be afraid to invest in anything. People tried to take out all their savings out of their banks, but their money was not in the banks, since banks typically only hold fractions of the amount of money their customers have, because they've either invested or loaned out the rest. Many lost all their savings, and on March 6, 1933, President Roosevelt declared it to be a bank holiday, where all banks had to close and could only reopen after being deemed solved by government inspectors. President Roosevelt introduced the New Deal to society, a series of programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations to help America get back on track. But it barely made a dent in any of the damages done and ended up making it worse on citizens by raising taxes to pay for various programs, such as the National Recovery Administration, which ultimately didn't work. The Federal Reserve barely helped the economy during the Great Depression because at the time it lacked structure and organization due to the fact that it was separated into different districts run by different governors who never agreed on anything. Occasionally, when all the districts worked together, they would implement bad policies that did not help public interest and created worse economic problems. Lastly, they did not help the banks out. When the banks began to fail, the Federal Reserve loaned no money to them to keep them alive. The only thing that restored the American economy was World War II in 1939. 12 million Americans were employed as soldiers. Many Americans left not in the Army had defense-related jobs building things for the war, taking care of 17 million unemployed Americans. Americans sold war products to other countries, increasing their global trade and economy. After World War II, the government tried to keep the economy on track by having a freer market, balancing budgets, and lowering taxes. They repealed the excess profit tax, cut the corporate tax to 38%, cut the top income tax to 86%, and in 1948 cut the marginal rate further to 82%. This led businesses to keep most of what they earned. The Great Depression has some devastating effects. 7 million people died from starvation, and many citizens found themselves wound up in crime due to having to steal to provide for themselves. Many citizens turned to suicide in their time of despair. The Great Depression, even when over, left an immense impact on society that could not be repaired by fixing the economy. The Great Recession was the second worst economic downturn in modern American history, lasting from 2008 to 2010. Millions of people lost their homes, savings, and jobs. Unemployment raised to 10% of Americans' population. In the 2000s, the Federal Reserve had a monetary policy, which is the macroeconomic policy to help manage the economy, that was too loose, which encouraged people to buy houses and created an asset bubble. Many acts were put into place making it easier for someone to buy a home without necessarily having the money to do so, such as the Community Reinvestment Act and the Americans Dream Down Payment Assistance Act. More families were able to get loans easier and buy houses, but could not pay back these loans, and when banks didn't get returns for these loans, the houses would become foreclosed, and some banks failed. The Federal Reserve took a non traditional route of getting America out of the Great Recession by making a credit easing program, reducing the federal funds rate, and producing money to put into the banks to keep them alive. Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time of the recession, wrote in his book, Courage to Act, that if it wasn't for the actions taken by the Federal Reserve, America would be in an economically worse state than they were in the Great Depression. The Great Recession has some lasting effects, such as homelessness still being a major issue and businesses who closed during the Great Recession have not reopened. But since the Great Recession, the unemployment rate has dropped from 10% to 3.9%. The stock market has fully recovered and the middle class is flourishing. While there are still issues in the economy, the aftermath of the Great Recession is not as severe as it could have been. Some of the main causes of the Great Depression and Great Recession were caused by the government. In the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates artificially low during the 20s and then raised them, and in the Great Recession, the government pushed homeownership. The difference in the two is during the Great Recession, the government took the appropriate actions to get us out, while in the Great Depression, the government's actions were very unhelpful. There is a lot to learn from the Great Depression and Recession. Always be aware of the risks of your investment. Know that experts don't know everything and their intentions could be greedy. The market is something that cannot simply be mapped out. It changes all the time and there is no 100% guarantee it will give you the returns you want. And normally there's some sort of economic boom before a recession, so find a secure way to save money while you can.